At 60, something profound begins to shift inside a human being. It is not the body that announces the change, it is the soul. For decades, you may have walked the path that others expected from you. You carried responsibilities, played roles, fulfilled duties, and tried to match the world's rhythm. But 60 is different. At 60, the inner voice becomes stronger than the expectations that have shaped you for most of your life. For many decades, people move according to obligations, family duties, career demands, social norms, cultural pressures. You learn early that your worth is often measured by how much you can do, how well you can behave, how consistently you can meet the standards around you. And because life moves fast, you rarely have the space to stop and question whether those standards truly belong to you. You simply follow the rhythm presented by society, stepping into patterns that are handed to you rather than chosen. But something transformative begins to happen. When a person reaches 60, the rhythm changes. Not because the world becomes quieter, but because the mind develops a different kind of clarity. At this stage, the inner voice that always existed, but was often buried under responsibility, begins to rise to the surface. It doesn't shout, and it doesn't demand. Instead, it speaks with the calm authority that comes from a lifetime of experiences. It carries every lesson you've lived through, every joy, every loss, every mistake, every moment of growth. While the outer world continues to tell you who you should be, this inner voice finally begins to show you who you are. This shift is not about abandoning responsibilities or walking away from the world. It is about realizing that the loudest expectations are not always the truest ones. There comes a moment when you look back at the road behind you and see how many choices were influenced by fear of judgment, fear of failing others, fear of not fitting in. At 60, that fear begins to lose its power. It isn't that you become careless. It is that you become more aware of what truly matters. You start to understand that time is a teacher and truth is a companion. You've seen enough, lived enough, and felt enough to recognize the difference between the life you wanted and the life you tolerated. And in that recognition, your inner voice finally gathers strength. It tells you that you no longer need to apologize for being yourself. You no longer need to shrink so others feel comfortable or chase approval that never filled your heart. You no longer need to shape your decisions around the expectations of people who do not carry your burdens, live your memories, or understand your spirit. The voice inside you becomes clearer, and with that clarity comes freedom, not the loud, dramatic kind, but a quiet, steady liberation that grows from within. This inner voice guides you to protect your peace, choose your battles wisely, and value the simplicity you once overlooked. It reminds you that the world's demands will never end, but your energy is precious and must be directed with intention. You start seeing through the layers of noise, the comparisons, the judgments, the unnecessary pressures, and what remains is the essence of who you truly are. At 60, you discover the strength that comes from authenticity. You find yourself caring less about how your choices appear to others and more about how those choices feel within you. The shift is subtle but powerful. Instead of asking, "What do they want from me?" you begin asking, "What does my soul need now?" And as this question grows louder, the expectations that once felt heavy begin to lose their grip. You realize that the voice inside you is not just a whisper, it is wisdom accumulated through a lifetime. And for the first time, you give it the attention it always deserved. Reaching 60 brings with it a quiet but profound transformation, the movement away from pleasing others, and the beginning of truly understanding yourself. For much of life, many people are influenced, often unconsciously, by a desire to fit in, to belong, to avoid conflict, to maintain harmony, or simply to not disappoint those around them. This desire to please is not a weakness. It is a natural response shaped by family expectations, cultural norms, and the wish to be accepted. Yet over time, constantly adjusting who you are for the comfort of others creates an invisible distance between your inner world and the life you are living. At 60, that distance becomes visible. You feel it more clearly, and for the first time, you begin to question why you spent so many years bending, adjusting, and silencing parts of yourself to meet expectations that were never your own. This shift does not happen abruptly. It grows slowly, like dawn light spreading across a dark sky. You start noticing small things at first, the way certain conversations drain you, the way some relationships feel one-sided, the way you hesitate to say what you truly feel because you've been conditioned to keep peace. But then you also notice something else. Your tolerance for self-neglect begins to fade. You no longer have the same desire to chase approval. The emotional cost of pleasing others starts to outweigh the temporary comfort it brings. And in that moment, a new kind of awareness arises. Understanding yourself is not about becoming selfish. It is about recognizing that your needs, feelings, and boundaries matter just as much as anyone else's. You begin to see that for most of your life, you were trained to prioritize external harmony over internal honesty. You said yes when your heart said no. You accepted situations that drained your spirit. You allowed others to take more from you than was healthy, not because you lacked strength, but because you believed that being good meant being agreeable. But 60 teaches you something that earlier years often hide. A person who constantly pleases others eventually loses the ability to hear their own soul. When understanding yourself becomes your new path, everything begins to shift. You start asking different questions, gentler but deeper ones. Instead of, what will they think? You ask, instead of, how do I keep everyone happy? You ask, what brings me peace? Instead of trying to maintain every relationship, you begin to evaluate which ones nourish you and which ones wound you. You learn to recognize the difference between compromise and self-betrayal. And as this understanding grows, you notice that your inner world becomes lighter, clearer, and more aligned with who you truly are. Understanding yourself also means seeing your own patterns with compassion. You reflect on past decisions, not with regret, but with awareness. You begin to understand why you stayed silent, why you hid parts of yourself, why you feared disappointing others. You realize that these patterns were born from a desire for connection, not weakness. And with that understanding comes the freedom to release them. If you learn to honor your boundaries not as walls, but as necessary spaces for your well-being, you speak more honestly, not to provoke others, but to stay truthful to yourself. You walk away from situations that steal your peace, not out of anger, but out of respect for your life's remaining time. At 60, the journey turns inward. You begin to value authenticity over acceptance, sincerity over admiration, and inner balance over outer approval. And as you choose understanding over pleasing, you finally grant yourself permission to be real, to live according to the rhythm of your own soul rather than the expectations of the world. Letting go becomes more powerful than accumulating as you reach 60, because you begin to understand the truth that younger years often blur. Carrying too much emotionally, mentally, physically slows the spirit. For most of life, people are taught to gather, build, acquire, and hold on. You gather responsibilities, possessions, achievements, relationships, memories, identities, and even burdens that do not belong to you. You hold on because you believe that more means safer, more means stronger, more means successful. Yet the hidden cost of more often remains unnoticed until the soul has lived long enough to feel its weight. At 60, the shift begins quietly. You start to sense that the things you once rushed to collect no longer have the same meaning. Objects that once symbolized security begin to feel like clutter. Expectations from others begin to feel like unnecessary pressure. Old emotional wounds begin to feel like luggage you are tired of carrying. And ambitions that were once urgent begin to soften. Because something inside you whispers that the true measure of a life well lived is not how much you hold, but how freely you can breathe. Letting go does not mean giving up. It means making space. It means allowing what no longer strengthens you to gently fall away. It means understanding that release is not a loss, but a form of inner cleansing. You begin to see that every item, every belief, every obligation, and every memory has its time. Some to teach you, some to challenge you, some to shape you, and some simply to be outgrown. The wisdom of 60 allows you to recognize which is which. You may find yourself opening old boxes, both literal and emotional, and realizing that the things you stored so carefully have lost their meaning. You may look at relationships that once demanded your patience and realize that your heart no longer has space for those constant battles. You may examine old beliefs, ideas about who you should be, how life should unfold, or what success should look like, and discover that they were borrowed, inherited, or imposed rather than chosen. And as you begin letting go of these layers, a sense of relief emerges, almost like taking off heavy armor after a long journey. What makes letting go powerful at this stage of life is the clarity that comes from experience. You no longer fear being empty, because you have learned that emptiness is not a void, it is a beginning. You release the need to prove anything to anyone. You release the desire to hold on to every opportunity, every relationship, every object, just in case. You release the emotional ties to the past that once dictated your identity, and each act of release becomes an act of self-respect, a declaration that your peace matters more than your possessions, more than other people's expectations, and more than the stories you once told yourself. Letting go also opens doors to a deeper kind of presence. When your arms are full, you cannot reach for something new. When your mind is crowded, you cannot hear your inner wisdom. When your heart is cluttered with unhealed weight, you cannot fully experience the beauty of the moment in front of you. The gift of 60 is that you begin to make room for simplicity, not because life is slowing down, but because your soul is waking up. You start to realize that the fewer burdens you carry, the more clearly you can walk your path. And so, letting go becomes an act of maturity, strength, and courage. It becomes a way of honoring your remaining years with gentleness instead of heaviness. It becomes a way of choosing freedom over attachment, clarity over confusion, and inner lightness over outer accumulation. Because at 60, you finally understand that you were never meant to hold everything. You were meant to hold only what gives your spirit space to grow. Peace, presence, and meaning begin to replace urgency and noise as a person reaches 60, because the nature of priorities quietly transforms. Earlier in life, the pace is fast, almost relentless. You wake up with lists to complete, goals to pursue, deadlines to meet, and expectations to fulfill. Life feels like a race where slowing down seems risky, as though pausing for a moment might cause you to fall behind. You measure your days by productivity, your value by achievement, and your progress by comparison with others. The noise of the world becomes the rhythm of your life. Constant notifications, opinions, obligations, and distractions. But with time, the soul grows tired of the constant motion. Not weak, not defeated, just wiser. And at 60, that wisdom finally rises to the surface. A subtle shift begins. The urgent things no longer feel as urgent. You start to see that much of the rush you lived with was created by external forces, not internal truth. You were running because the world told you to run, not because your heart needed speed. You chased things simply because others chased them. You hurried without questioning why. At 60, you begin to question everything, not out of doubt, but out of clarity. You notice that even when you slowed down physically, something inside you remained unsettled, restless, looking for something deeper than achievement or recognition. That restlessness becomes a doorway, and through it, peace begins to enter. Peace does not arrive loudly. It enters like a gentle breeze in small moments when you realize that conflict is no longer worth your energy, that rushing steals more from you than it gives, and that your time is too precious to waste on battles that do not nourish your spirit. You begin choosing silence over unnecessary arguments, patience over irritation, and acceptance over resistance. Not because you don't care, but because you finally care about the right things: your well-being, your balance, your inner harmony. Presence becomes the next transformation. After decades of living in the future, planning, striving, worrying, you begin to rediscover the value of the present moment. You notice the warmth of sunlight, the texture of the air, the softness of your breath. You pay attention to conversations rather than rushing through them. You observe your surroundings instead of constantly thinking ahead. Presence becomes a skill, and then a comfort, and eventually a way of living. You understand that life was always happening here, in this moment, and that the beauty you once missed was never far away. It was simply overshadowed by urgency. Meaning begins to replace noise as well. You start asking deeper questions. What actually matters? What brings true fulfillment? What remains important in the long run? These questions shape your days differently. Instead of filling your schedule, you refine it. Instead of saying yes out of obligation, you choose selectively. Instead of investing your energy in endless tasks, you direct it toward what nourishes your inner life. This might mean spending time with people who uplift you, engaging in activities that bring joy, or simply allowing yourself quiet moments of reflection. Meaning becomes the lens through which you see life, and with that shift, unnecessary noise naturally fades. At 60, you realize that much of what once felt essential was simply background noise, expectations, pressure, competition, and fear. And when you let that noise fade, a new kind of clarity emerges. You begin to understand that peace is not something you search for, but something you create. Presence is not something you occasionally practice, but something you choose again and again. Meaning is not something you find by accident, but something you cultivate through intention. And so, the urgency of earlier years dissolves, not because life is slowing down, but because your spirit is finally aligning with what truly matters. The world may continue to rush, but you no longer feel the need to run with it. You begin to move with purpose, with calm, and with the quiet strength that comes from knowing that peace, presence, and meaning are the real treasures of a life well lived. Life experiences are seen as preparation rather than punishment as a person reaches 60, because over time, the meaning of challenges and hardships transforms. When you are younger, struggles often feel unfair, sudden, or even unbearable. You might wonder why certain situations happen to you, why loss or disappointment struck at the moments it did, or why life seems to present obstacles that test your patience, strength, and resilience. At the time, it is easy to interpret these experiences as punishment or misfortune, as if the world is against you. Pain feels heavy, and mistakes linger as marks of personal failure. But as decades pass, you begin to perceive life differently. The hardships you once endured begin to reveal themselves, not as punishment, but as preparation, training for the person you are meant to become. Each difficulty carries a lesson, even if it is invisible at first. A failed relationship, a professional setback, a personal loss, or a period of confusion all contribute to your understanding of the world and yourself. At 60, you start to recognize the hidden patterns and gifts that each experience offered. The mistakes you made become teachers, rather than stains on your record. The challenges you faced become mirrors that allowed you to see the depths of your courage, patience, and resilience. Even regrets, which once felt heavy and shameful, now serve as reminders of how far you have come, how much you have learned, and how your soul has grown through endurance. Preparation manifests in subtle ways. It is not always about dramatic triumphs or sudden epiphanies. Sometimes it is the quiet wisdom gained from repeated mistakes that teaches you what to embrace and what to release. Sometimes it is the resilience forged through disappointment that gives you the courage to face the unknown without fear. Sometimes it is the patience developed through waiting and uncertainty that allows you to approach life with calm clarity. The accumulation of experiences, both joyful and painful, builds an internal strength that no book, advice, or external guidance could ever provide. At 60, the realization dawns that every phase of life was shaping you for this moment of awareness. You begin to see connections between events that once seemed random or cruel. The people who left, the opportunities you missed, the failures you endured, they were all teaching you something essential about yourself, about life, and about how to move forward with greater authenticity. Even experiences that once caused deep sorrow now carry a sense of gratitude because they prepared you to recognize what truly matters. You begin to understand that the purpose of hardship is not to punish, but to awaken, to strengthen, and to prepare. This perspective changes how you approach life going forward. You no longer fear mistakes in the same way. You no longer measure setbacks as disasters or see challenges as signs of weakness. Instead, each obstacle becomes an opportunity for growth, each difficulty a lesson in resilience, and each disappointment a step toward wisdom. You start to trust the process of life, knowing that even confusion and struggle have their role in preparing your mind and soul for greater understanding. Life becomes less about control and more about learning, less about frustration and more about insight, less about reaction and more about response. As preparation becomes the lens through which you view experiences, your approach to the future shifts. You understand that life's unpredictability is not a threat, but a teacher. You see that preparation does not require perfection, only presence, reflection, and willingness to grow. The accumulation of experiences is no longer a burden, but a reservoir of strength. You begin to walk with confidence, not because life has been easy, but because it has trained you to navigate with wisdom, patience, and clarity. And in that recognition, the past becomes not a chain that binds, but a foundation that supports, guiding you toward the life you were always capable of living. 60 is not an ending, it is the beginning of authentic truth, because by this stage of life, the layers that once obscured who you are begin to peel away. For many years, identity is shaped by external forces, family expectations, societal pressures, cultural norms, professional roles, and the judgments of others. You learn to wear masks, to play roles, and to conform in ways that ensure acceptance, success, and safety. These masks serve a purpose when you are young, but over decades, they accumulate and begin to feel heavy, hiding the essence of your spirit. At 60, there is a quiet but undeniable awareness that life is too precious to continue living beneath layers that no longer serve you. It is a stage when the soul calls for authenticity, and truth emerges not as a concept, but as a lived experience. This beginning of authentic truth is subtle, yet profound. It does not arrive as a sudden revelation, but rather as a gentle awakening. You start noticing the difference between living to meet expectations and living to honor your own inner voice. Decisions that once felt difficult or constrained now feel liberating. Boundaries, which may have seemed rigid or selfish in younger years, now feel necessary and sacred. You begin to understand that truth is not just about honesty with others. It is about honesty with yourself, with your own desires, feelings, and purpose. The recognition that your life can finally align with your true self is a powerful gift, one that often takes decades to fully appreciate. At 60, the awareness of mortality becomes clearer, and with it comes a refined sense of priorities. You realize that time is finite, that opportunities to live fully are precious, and that moments of authenticity cannot be postponed. The fears that once controlled choices, fear of judgment, failure, rejection, or inadequacy, begin to lose their power. You understand that these fears were often barriers to living truthfully, and now, with perspective and experience, you can move past them. Each choice, each interaction, and each moment becomes a conscious opportunity to reflect your genuine self rather than the self imposed by others or circumstances. This stage of life also allows you to embrace contradictions and imperfections within yourself without judgment. You recognize that authentic truth does not demand perfection or flawless behavior. It is a reflection of your entire journey, the joys and sorrows, the successes and failures, the courage and vulnerability. By acknowledging your full story, you cultivate a sense of completeness and wholeness that younger years may have obscured. Authenticity is no longer aspirational. It becomes natural, effortless, and deeply grounding. It is a truth that is lived rather than performed. Relationships, too, are transformed by this newfound authenticity. You begin to choose connections that resonate with your true self and release those that drain or distort your spirit. Conversations become more meaningful, interactions more sincere, and the presence of others becomes richer when shared in honesty. At 60, you understand that truth attracts, not repels. Living authentically draws people and experiences that align with your soul, creating a life that is less crowded by superficial expectations and more filled with genuine resonance. Finally, the beginning of authentic truth at 60 allows you to approach life with a new sense of freedom. You are no longer bound by the need to prove yourself, conform, or perform. You walk with confidence that comes from self-knowledge, experience, and the courage to honor your inner voice. You begin to live in alignment with your own rhythm, guided by wisdom accumulated over decades, and shaped by a deep understanding that life is most meaningful when it reflects the essence of who you truly are. It is a beginning because from this point forward,